Don't touch that coffin. Ava's voice broke the silence in the room, making everyone jump. The little girl, just 7 years old, was shaking. She pointed at the closed casket where her mother was supposed to be. Her face was red with worry, and her eyes were full of tears. "She's not in there. Mommy's alive," she shouted. People gasped in shock. They looked confused and uncomfortable. Julian, Ava's dad, stood behind her, frozen. He reached out to her, but Ava stepped away, her little fists tight at her sides. "You're all liars," she yelled. I saw her yesterday by the window. She was looking at me." The people in the room started whispering to each other. "Poor child," one person said. "She's in denial," another whispered, glancing at Julian. Julian finally spoke, his voice shaky. "Ava, honey, come here. Let's talk," he said as he knelt down in front of her. But Ava shook her head. "No, I don't want to talk. You don't believe me." "Nobody does." Tears fell from her eyes, and she ran out of the room. Julian sat on her bed, his hands shaking. "Ava, sweetheart, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice quiet. "Where's Mommy?" Ava asked, pulling the covers up to her chin. Julian's heart hurt. "She's not coming back, baby. Mommy's in heaven now." Ava stared at him for a moment, her forehead wrinkled. "Heaven like in the stories?" she asked. Julian nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, sweetie, she's happy there." Ava thought for a moment. Then she asked the question Julian didn't know how to answer. "But why, Daddy? Why did she leave? When will I see her again?" Julian didn't know what to say. The doctor said it was a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. But Catherine, Ava's mom, had been healthy just the day before. There were no signs that anything was wrong. Julian just got a phone call from the hospital that changed everything. The funeral was strange too. Normally, a burial would happen right away, but the coroner had delayed it for almost a week. Then, Julian had gotten a strange call. "Mr. Stephen," the coroner had said, "the coffin must remain sealed. Under no circumstances should it be opened. Do you understand?" Julian had asked why, but the coroner wouldn't explain. He just kept saying, "It's for the common good." Julian didn't argue. He was too tired and too sad to push for answers. But now, watching Ava run away, he regretted not asking more questions. Outside, Ava had found a spot under an old tree. She sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, her little body shaking with sobs. Julian quietly walked up to her. "Ava," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Why don't you believe me?" she asked, her voice muffled as she hid her face in her arms. "I saw her. I know I did." Julian didn't know what to say. He wanted to comfort her, but how could he? He didn't understand it either. "Maddie," he sighed, "I miss her too, more than anything, but she's gone. We have to accept that." Ava finally looked up at him, her tear-streaked face full of determination. "She wouldn't leave me, Daddy. She wouldn't. I saw her, by the window. She's hiding from us." Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. The way Ava spoke, with so much certainty, made his heart ache. Could it be true? But no, it had to be just grief, right? Before he could say anything, a shadow fell over them. He looked up to see his old friend, Dylan Rowland, standing nearby. Dylan was a detective. "Julian," Dylan said calmly, "I just got here. I'm so sorry about Catherine." Julian nodded but couldn't speak. "I need your help," he said quietly. Dylan looked at Ava, then back at Julian. "What's going on?" he asked. Julian hesitated. "There are things I don't understand," he admitted. Dylan folded his arms, looking serious. "Start from the beginning," he said. Julian told Dylan everything that had happened in the past week, speaking softly. Just then, the funeral official interrupted them. "Mr. Stephen," the man said, "we really need to continue with the service." Julian flinched. His face looked pale. "I told you, I need more time," he snapped, surprising even Dylan with the sharpness in his voice. The official didn't look concerned. "The guests are waiting. We have a schedule to keep. We can't delay much longer," he said in a businesslike tone. Julian stood up, his anger rising. "You think any of this is normal? My wife is dead, my daughter is upset, and you're worried about a schedule?" Dylan stepped closer to the official. "Maybe it's better if we take a moment," he said calmly. The official hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "I'll give you a few minutes," he said and walked away. As the official left, Dylan turned to Julian. "Something's wrong with him. Dylan said quietly. Why is he in such a hurry? Julian sighed. I don't know, Dylan. Maybe he's just doing his job. But Dylan didn't seem convinced. You've been through a lot, he said. But that guy's acting like he wants this over more than you do. Julian sat down in a pew, feeling exhausted. I've been so focused on Ava, I didn't notice anything else, he admitted. Dylan put a hand on Julian's shoulder. You need to call off the service. Something's not right here. The delay, the sealed coffin, the way the official is acting, it's all strange. Julian stared at the casket, his jaw tightening. What do I tell everyone? That we're canceling because the funeral guy is acting weird? Dylan looked at him firmly. Because your gut is telling you something's wrong. And mine is too. Later, when the guests left and the house was quiet, Dylan stayed behind. Ava had gone to bed, and Julian was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his cup of coffee. I need to ask you something, Dylan said. About Catherine. Julian didn't look up. What about her? The doctor said it was a heart attack, Dylan said. But you never saw her body, right? Julian froze. His hands tightened around the cup. No, he admitted. The hospital called me while I was at work. By the time I got there, she was already prepared. They told me it was better that way. And then there was the coroner, Anderson, telling me not to open the coffin under any circumstances. Dylan frowned. And you didn't think to question that? I was in shock. Julian snapped, his voice breaking. I didn't know what to do. All I wanted was to get through it for Ava. Dylan sighed. Okay, but Anderson retired 3 years ago. Are you sure that's who you talked to? Julian shook his head. I didn't really look at him much. I just wanted it over with. Well, Dylan said, I'll look into him. Something doesn't add up. The next morning, Ava came downstairs. She was holding her stuffed rabbit and rubbing her eyes. Morning, kiddo, Dylan said gently. Hi, Ava mumbled, sitting down next to her dad. She looked serious. Daddy, I saw Mommy, she said. Julian froze. What do you mean, sweetheart? Ava looked between the two men. 2 days ago, she was outside my window. She waved at me. Julian rubbed his temples. Ava, honey, you've been through a lot. Sometimes, when we're sad, we imagine things. No, Ava shouted. It wasn't my imagination. I saw her. Julian shook his head. Please, Ava, don't do this to yourself. Mommy's gone, and we have to accept that. Dylan interrupted gently. Let her talk, Julian. Kids don't make things like this up. Let's hear her out. Ava took a deep breath. She was wearing a hat and dark clothes. She smiled at me and waved. She didn't say anything. Julian looked down. This is just grief, Dylan. It has to be. But Dylan looked at Ava kindly. I believe you. Can you tell me more? Did she look different? Ava nodded. She was hiding, I think. She didn't want Daddy to see her, but she wanted me to know she was okay. Dylan smiled at her. You're doing great, Ava. I believe you, and I'll help you figure this out. Later, after Ava left the room, Dylan turned to Julian. We need to take this seriously, he said. Julian rubbed his temples. She's just a kid, Dylan. She's grieving. She's seeing things. Dylan interrupted, making it clear that no matter if Ava's story was true or not, it was important to her, and that made it important to him too. Julian sighed, leaning back in his chair. What are you going to do? He asked. Dylan stood up, his face serious. I'm going to keep looking into it. I'll start with the places Ava mentioned. Maybe there's something or someone that can explain this, but I'll need you to keep an eye on her. Don't dismiss what she says, Julian. It matters. Julian nodded slowly, but he didn't look convinced. He watched as Dylan grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Dylan wanted to believe Ava's story, but something inside him still doubted it. He couldn't just ignore what Ava had said. That night, as Dylan lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about what Ava had told him. The image of a woman standing by the playground, hiding behind trees, made him feel uneasy. If Ava was telling the truth, it seemed like something dangerous was going on. There were too many questions and no answers. The next morning, Dylan decided to investigate further. He parked his car far enough away from Ava's house so no one would notice, but close enough to see where she went. He wanted to know the truth. Ava came out of her house a little while later, walking toward the school. She looked around carefully, like she was checking if anyone was watching. Dylan followed her, making sure to keep a safe distance. When Ava reached the edge of the neighborhood, the houses stopped and there was a small path with trees on both sides. Dylan slowed down and watched carefully. He felt something wasn't right. Then, he saw the woman. At first, she was just a shadow behind a tree. But when Ava wasn't looking, the woman stared at her with a strange, cold look, like she was watching her closely. When Ava turned to leave, the woman quickly ran into the woods. Dylan hurried after her, careful not to make any noise. He ran down the path, pushing past branches and rocks on the ground, following the woman. She moved fast, but Dylan kept chasing her. After a while, the woman reached a small cabin near a lake. There was a black car parked outside. Dylan crouched behind some bushes, watching through a window. Inside, he saw the woman, who had taken off her hat. Her hair was short and messy. Dylan felt his heart skip a beat. It was Catherine. The other person in the room was a young man with tattoos all over his arms. He tried to hear their conversation. The man said, "You can't stay here much longer. They'll find you." The woman, Catherine, replied, "I can't leave them like this. Ava needs me. And Julian." The man was angry. "Julian doesn't need anything except closure. You've done enough. The only way to protect them is to leave for good." Catherine looked sad. She wiped her face and said, "I love them. I didn't want this." Dylan couldn't believe it. The woman who was supposed to be dead, the woman he'd known for years, was alive and hiding. Her name was Elsa now, but Dylan knew her as Catherine. He had to know more. Suddenly, a branch cracked under his foot. Dylan froze, and so did the people inside the cabin. Someone was coming out. The man with the gun stepped into the woods, looking for whoever was spying on them. Dylan quickly pressed himself against the ground, hoping the man wouldn't see him. The man walked closer, the flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. "Who's out there?" he shouted. Dylan's heart raced, but he didn't move. The man's flashlight passed right over him, and then the man shouted again, "I see you." Dylan scrambled to his feet, but before he could react, a shot rang out. The bullet hit Dylan in the shoulder, and he fell to the ground, gasping for air. Pain spread across his body, but he forced himself to get up. "Stay down," the man yelled. Catherine suddenly ran out of the cabin, screaming, "What are you doing?" She tried to stop the man from shooting, and in that moment, Dylan jumped forward, grabbing the man and tackling him to the ground. They struggled, hitting the ground hard. Dylan finally got control and kicked the gun away. But then another shot rang out. This time it missed them, hitting a tree. Catherine screamed again. Dylan and the man kept fighting, rolling in the dirt, trying to get control of the gun. Just when it seemed like the man was going to get the gun back, Dylan grabbed his ankle and pulled him down. The gun slid away again. By now, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. "It's over," Dylan said, breathing hard. The man stopped, staring at Dylan. He was out of options. Soon, police officers rushed into the forest, their guns drawn. "Drop to the ground. Hands where we can see them," they shouted. The man was arrested, and so was Catherine. Dylan leaned against a tree, exhausted, his shoulder bleeding. He watched as Catherine was taken away, her head down. For a second, their eyes met. There was no anger in her gaze, only sadness. Later, Dylan sat across from Catherine in the police station. She was staring at her hands, her face full of guilt. Dylan asked her, "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell Julian the truth?" Catherine, no, Elsa, looked up at him. "I didn't want to hurt them," she said softly. "I wanted to protect Julian and Ava. I didn't want to bring danger to them." Dylan shook his head. "But you lied. You kept the truth from them, and it only made things worse." Catherine's eyes were full of tears. She was trying not to cry. "I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice shaking. "You think I wanted this? To live every day scared that someone from my past would come and ruin everything? To look at my daughter and wonder if she'll hate me one day if she finds out?" Dylan looked at her, his face softening a little, but his voice was still firm. "Catherine, or Elsa, whoever you are right now, this is not just about you anymore. You have to take responsibility for them now." Catherine sighed and started to cry. "I love them, Dylan. I love them so much. And now I've lost them." Julian stood outside the room, his hands shaking. He had heard enough of the conversation and felt like his world was falling apart. Dylan stepped out, looking worried, but Julian didn't say anything. You just walked into the room? When Catherine saw Julian, her face turned even sadder. Julian, don't, she whispered. But Julian interrupted her, his voice shaking. Just don't. You've been lying to me for so long. I don't even know who you are anymore. Catherine looked down, feeling like his words hurt more than she ever thought possible. I didn't lie about loving you. I didn't lie about Ava. I did everything to protect us. I love you both. Julian felt like his heart was breaking. But you've been lying to me from the beginning. You made me build a life with someone who doesn't even exist. I exist. Catherine cried, stepping closer to him. The love we shared, the family we built, it's real. Julian shook his head, tears in his eyes. I don't know what to believe anymore. Catherine's voice was soft and sad. You can hate me for everything else, but don't doubt my love for you and Ava. That's the only thing that's real. But Julian couldn't say anything. He couldn't meet her eyes. There was only silence between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. You should have trusted me. Catherine sat down, her hands in her lap, and started crying again. Julian turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. Dylan was standing outside, waiting. He looked at Julian, who looked broken. Dylan asked softly, What do you want to do now? Julian looked down. I don't know. I just need to think. Back in the interrogation room, Elsa was sitting still, staring at the table. Her hands were cuffed, and she looked tired and sad. Dylan was across from her, his eyes hard, and he placed a photo on the table. It was an old picture from when Elsa was in Zurich. Do you recognize this? Dylan asked. It showed Elsa with her brother, Nathaniel, standing outside a jewelry store. This was taken 12 years ago. Interpol has you listed as part of the crew responsible for the Zurich heist. You and Nathaniel were involved. Elsa didn't say anything. She just looked at the picture, her face sad. Dylan went on. We know about the heist. We know about your fake death. But what we don't know is why you came back to all of this. Why didn't you leave it behind for good? Elsa's voice was quiet. I didn't come back. That life ended when I walked away. I wanted to be done with it. Then why is Nathaniel still involved? Why did he drag you back into all of this? Dylan asked. Elsa clenched her fists. Because Nathaniel is my brother. He helped me disappear, but he never forgave me for leaving. When he found me again, he gave me a choice. Either leave Julian and Ava, or watch them suffer. Meanwhile, Ava was sitting on the porch, holding her stuffed rabbit tightly. Julian was standing nearby, looking sad. They didn't speak, but both felt the weight of everything they had learned. Ava finally broke the silence. She's a criminal, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. Julian turned to her, surprised. Ava, it's more complicated than that. Ava's eyes were filled with tears. She lied to us. How could she do that if she really loves us? Julian's heart hurt seeing his daughter in pain, but he didn't know how to explain it. Sometimes people do the wrong things for the right reasons, he said softly. Ava shook her head. That's not good enough. She left us. Julian hugged her, trying to comfort her. I know it hurts, but we'll figure this out, okay? Just you and me. Back at the station, Dylan kept trying to find out more about Elsa's past. Every lead he followed told him that Elsa had been trying to escape her past. She and Nathaniel had been the masterminds of a heist that stole $10 million in jewels, but they had been caught in Spain. Elsa was believed to have died in an explosion, but she had actually faked her death. Later, Dylan found a new report about Nathaniel. He's smuggling arms now, Dylan said, and not just small-time stuff. This is serious. He slammed the file shut, his face angry. This isn't just about Elsa anymore. Nathaniel's using her, and now her family is paying the price. That evening, Julian came to the station. I need to see her, he said quietly. Dylan led him to Elsa's interrogation room. When Julian walked in, Elsa looked up. Julian, she said, her voice breaking. They both stood in silence for a moment. Julian didn't know what to say. I don't know where to start, he said finally. I'm angry, hurt, and just tired. Elsa lowered her gaze. I don't blame you for being angry. You have every right to be. I don't hate you, Julian said. I loved you. I built my life around you. And now, I find out that none of it was real. Elsa looked up at him. It was real, she said desperately. The love we shared, the family we built, it was real. I loved you. I still love you. Then why didn't you tell me the truth? Julian asked, his voice rising. Why didn't you trust me? Elsa's eyes filled with tears. Because I was scared. Scared you would leave me. Scared my past would destroy us. Julian shook his head. You destroyed us, Elsa. Not your past. You. Elsa dropped her head, sobbing. After a long silence, Julian took a deep breath and said, I can't do this anymore. I need to think about Ava. She deserves better than this. Elsa looked up at him, her heart breaking. Please, Julian, don't take her away from me. But Julian didn't look back as he walked to the door. You already took yourself away, Elsa. Now, I have to clean up what's left. And with that, he left her alone with her regrets. In the courtroom, Elsa and Nathaniel were both sentenced to 20 years in prison. Elsa didn't feel surprised, but hearing it made it real. Nathaniel didn't react at all. The guards were taking them away when Elsa turned around, looking for her family. She saw Julian and Ava in the second row, with Dylan beside them. Please, just one moment, Elsa said, her voice trembling. The guards nodded, and Elsa walked toward Ava. She knelt in front of her daughter, tears in her eyes. I love you more than anything, Elsa whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. The lies, the pain. I never wanted to hurt you. Ava was holding her stuffed rabbit tightly, and she looked up with tears in her eyes. Mommy, she whispered. Elsa reached out and gently touched Ava's cheek. Be strong for your daddy, Elsa said. He needs you. Ava hugged Elsa tightly, whispering, I forgive you. Elsa couldn't hold back her tears. Thank you, sweet girl, she whispered. The guard stepped closer, and Elsa gave Ava one last look before standing up. She turned to Julian. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, but I want you to know, I never stopped loving you. Both of you. Julian didn't say anything, but he nodded slightly. Elsa was led away, her chains clinking as she walked out of the courtroom. Julian knew leaving their old life behind was the right choice. They moved to a small town, far away from the whispers of their past. Ava was quiet, but she made a new friend named Sophie, who helped her smile again. One night, Julian asked Ava if she thought her mom would ever come back. Ava didn't answer, but Julian promised her that no matter what, they would be okay. As Julian tucked her into bed, he thought about everything they had been through. He didn't know what the future held, but he promised himself he would protect Ava from the mistakes of the past. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more content like it, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest, inspiring, and heartwarming stories, and have the opportunity to engage with our growing community. Additionally, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comment section below. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to sharing more captivating narratives with you.